So I'm going to toss this over to Tom P. for a bunch of the deeper technical understanding, because Tom P. has spent more of his time with his head in config subsystem XML files and Carafe upgrades and OSGI bundles and wiring than any human being should have ever done in their entire life. But basically the session is about how are we going to support upgrades of OpenDaylight in a sane way. And I think I've said this before, but I'll say it now, which is I think the minimum requirement is that users should have some way to upgrade from one version to the next without losing the data they have entered into OpenDaylight. I think pretty much all other axes are free in this space, and obviously there are better and worse solutions. Like, it would be great if they could do that by just running a single command rather than having to, like, follow a set of instructions and documentation. But if we could provide instructions and documentation that did it, that would be 2 orders of magnitude better than what we have right now, which is basically go screw yourself. So I mean, Tom and I and a couple other people and a bunch of people in this room have worked through this, and I think there's 3 main axes to doing an upgrade. One of them is like updating the actual binary artifacts that are making up, which is 3. Which is how do you actually lay out the code artifacts that have changed from one version to the next version in place, or however you want to do that, to actually get the code to be the new code. And then there are 2 sets of places where there is data that can exist that needs to be carried over. There is config files for the config subsystem, and there are Yang data, model data in the data store. And so that's really the 3 things you have to worry about. One of them is the things we care about, which is upgrading the code, and the other 2 are the things users care about, which is the data that they have entered that presumably they don't want to lose as they move. Or at least they would like to understand how they're going to lose it and how they might recover it. So I think that's the high order bits in terms of like what we want to achieve, what the underlying problems are.
Well, yeah, these are the 3 high order things. Can anybody think of anything else in terms of upgrade?
One topic I would like to add is a cluster upgrade, either by shutting down.
Okay, that, yeah. So what we would. Okay, so this is basically a single node right now. Now, rolling upgrade, that's another story. I mean, we got to start somewhere with this. So,
in terms of a in-service upgrade, a cluster upgrade.
Okay, that's another. Okay, so in-service, you mean I want to keep the Carafe instance running and upgrade all the artifacts.
No, I want to keep the application running. It doesn't, like, all I'm saying is.
So there's 2. So I think
somewhere else in the cluster.
So I'm going to make a statement which other people can disagree with, but I would like to, in the Boron time frame, take in-service upgrade or in an OSGI runtime off the table. I'd love to get there, but I suspect that leaving it on the table is going to cause us to done as opposed to getting something useful. And I'd love to be wrong, but if we can get this working in the next 2 months, then let's talk about doing in-service either through clustering or otherwise. I think we need to get there.
Yeah, right. I totally agree. I think the first thing we need to be able to figure out is how can we seamlessly and easily, without too much pain, do an in-place upgrade on a single node. Right. That's to me that's the first baby step you need to take. Then we can think about how to do in-service. Sorry, somebody?
Thanks. So I would propose that the ability to back out an upgrade and put it back to its original state should be part of the requirement for any upgrade procedure. Rollback, yes.
How about the data plane? I mean, are you going to consider ensuring the data plane continues uninterrupted?
Will be disconnected. I mean, I'm not sure that we even support that from shutting down the controller and bringing it back up with no upgrades. In fact, I'm pretty sure in the common case that doesn't support it. So I'm gonna I'm gonna put things which is like this is my opinion. So I'm gonna say off the table. So don't take this to mean that we can't do it. But I think ISSU and you know, and this is both in the controller and the data plane. It's not that I don't think they're important. It's that I'd like to crawl first.
Yeah, because it's hard enough doing an in-place upgrade right now.
So the rollback thing, for what it's worth, I think it is really a matter of doing a CP minus R on the directory, and then trying it, and if it breaks, moving it back. Now that being said, you know, I don't know that we have any promises about the externalities, like if it blows up and shreds all of your netconf config and all of your netconf attached devices, I don't like you will get back the controller in exactly the state the controller was in. It makes no promises whatsoever about getting back your devices and this like anything the new controller did that is outside of the purview of the controller would have to be done in an application specific way. We could talk about it, but I'd say hopefully CP minus R and then moving it back is good enough for. And we'll hope that the threat model isn't that the new plugin is so bad that it literally renders the device state you had before inoperable.
There are additional files that need to be handled as well. The Carafe configuration files.
Yeah, that's number 3.
Carafe code.
Oh, so
Carafe and code are artifacts. Artifacts.
Well,
basically, you need to lay down your new artifacts.
But somebody could have changed.
Yes.
Yes,
Well,
they're
so-
right.
Log4j or.
Is /etc include everything? Includes so is this so if you change this to config substance XML files to like /etc
And you have the deploy folder.
/star.
Yeah.
Not deploy.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
the way I've done this to previous companies in the past with Carafe-based products is, so I mean you got to have an installer, right? OpenDaylight doesn't have an installer; it's just a distribution. So presumably people who are creating their own distributions are doing their own installers. So typically the way I've done this is you basically lay down the new art. Basically what we would do is just copy off what we needed to copy off, preserve, CFG files, whatever CFG files you need to preserve. Usually the data log directory, because you usually want to preserve the previous logs. Lay down the new artifacts, including Carafe, including all your code artifacts, wherever you put them, whether you put them in an M2 or under the system directory. Wipe out the data directory and restart. And if you got your features boot set up already, then you preserve your features boot, and then you restart, and Carafe will reinstall all with the new artifacts. That's how I've done it in the past. That is the only way I've known how to do it. If anybody's done it in any different ways, then...
About the CFG files that Carafe has, so whenever you have a features.xml file and you're doing an upgrade over there, you can easily put the override group. It basically replaces the existing CFG with the newer one. And
Yeah, if you have your own, you're talking about,
Yeah,
not the...
yeah.
Right, yeah, that, in your
Making the
features.
assumption right now that we are using, and I should put a comment like, so we're making the assumption, I think, in this, which is that people aren't using carafe.csv, CFG files. And I think that's mostly true in OpenDaylight. There are people that are using, there's like something.properties that people use.
Startup.
Custom.properties, which I guess also needs to go in this list. We have Carafe, CFG, we have custom.properties. Is there a startup.properties?
Yeah, there's a startup. There's a couple of those properties.
Are
I
these
forget.
all in,
They're under ETC.
and so essentially it sounds like we need a way to migrate all of Etsy. Okay. But I think that The assumption is, maybe that isn't the assumption. My assumption had been that sort of config files were the one thing, and there was a couple of Carafe CFG files we used. That's probably false. Are there other things that people are aware of that's?
But one thing, what Tom said earlier, we cannot simply replace that folder. I mean, if a user of the OpenDaylight system modifies it,
no, you can't,
CLI,
right.
you need to replay it on top of the
Yeah, that's what you do. You know what, and if you ship your own CFG files, you know to basically save those off and reapply them, and whatever. I think what we do we script it, right? We redo features boot and features repositories.
You need to patch only the diff on top of the...
Yeah. If you have an installer, you know how you install it. If you do it by features boot, then you rebuild your features boot in your features repository. You want to preserve what's in the PAX logging file as well, which...
It's changed by the CLI.
In fact, you could just take the previous one and copy it in, So that's how we do. So I think for number 3, it's more like steps. Okay, these are the things you need to, it's documentation, right?
So
you may need to preserve this and this in the etc.
So in my mind, these things all fall in one, which is they're basically the same as config subsystem files, these are text files that may have been altered by the user, which may have changed both in this release and by a user after the previous release, and you need to merge those diffs in a sane way, or tell them that you can't.
It's whatever you support too. If you don't support anybody changing startup properties for your product, you may not document. You say it's undocumented.
And I think it's fine for us to say, like, we don't support this. I mean, I think the exercise in Boron, I think, is really going to be about picking what you don't want to support in terms of upgrades, not picking what we do want to support. If you try and solve the total upgrade problem for all of OpenDaylight, we're going to die, because we haven't even started talking about Yang schemas that have changed and that maybe have to do a translation of your data in the data store. And the fact that you can't really do that offline because you would need to be able to get access to the level DB store, which is not really scriptable using normal tools, and so you have to really do it in Java. And I think these are sort of the two hard ones. And so figuring out what it is that is the minimum viable set of things we can do that actually helps, I think, is going to be the hard part here. And I don't have wonderful answers.
So, but in terms of the etc folder and CFG files, I think those are pretty well defined. I think you can pretty much figure out what you want to support as far as users changing what. I think that's pretty well scoped. And like I say, you have an installer, you rebuild certain things. You rebuild features boot, you can do that kind of thing. So config system, so config system XML files are a whole different ball of wax. At my company internally, we've done 3 upgrades now. And it's been a pain point every single time. You basically don't know what's possibly gonna break. You basically right now you basically just try to do the in-place upgrade, leaving the XML files as they are, and then just run it and see what breaks. You'll get your config pusher exceptions, and you have to try to decipher that stuff, and this can take hours. You have to go back through patches. It may be because you're missing a required capabilities. The code wiring could have changed. It's very hard to do it right now. If you're lucky, nothing changed and everything just works.
So just to give some background to what Tom is saying, essentially we have these config.xml, configuration XML files, and configuration XML files are defined in your, you want to do it?
No. The question.
Sure.
So this assumes that you ignore the fact that you have the schema for both the old XML files and the new ones. So
No, well, no. This is. No. This is a different. This is a different pattern, which is where we have a single XML file which contains both user configuration and wiring configuration.
Right.
And we want to preserve the user configuration, but accept the new from the previous installation, but accept the new wiring configuration from the new release.
Yes,
and those are both in the same
I was
file.
getting to that part. Yes, it's not. This. See, what makes this harder
But
is
nobody
that
upstream does. But almost a significant number of upstream projects don't.
nobody does. I've never seen anybody have. They all munge it into one. I don't think there's a pattern. I don't think anybody's figured out how you do it with config system. There's no documentation on it, on how to do it. And if there is a way to do it, I would expect it's pretty difficult and will not be easy and intuitive for people to understand. People don't understand it. Many people do not understand config Yang as it is now and struggle with it. I have. I'm sure many people in this room have. And I've seen it many times from people. But that's another. So usability is another thing with that. I mean, it's so as Colin said. I think that's the major pain point is that they're not separated. Your user-facing configuration that you want to preserve across upgrades is in with the the wiring stuff, which you have to get these changes on an upgrade. Otherwise, you're most likely you start up. I mean, the code's not going to start up correctly because it'll blow up. And I think. So, and these, if everybody, probably most folks are familiar, these files are under Etsy. They're on Etsy, OpenDaylight, Carafe, and they get shipped by features. So, every time we've gone through this, it's basically been manual changes, or we just say, sorry, you lose your, we've basically had to say you lose it. You lose your netconf mounts, you lose. That's the other thing was the way the config system worked, like previously when you push through the loopback, typically netconf mounts is what people would use the loopback for, but you could actually change any configuration in CSS through that mechanism. But what that does is actually that changes the whole deal. Every single XML file, every single module configuration now gets munged into one Uber file over in another directory. And then it starts reading from there. So even if you did something script to upgrade or to change the ones under OpenDaylight Carafe, it's not going to take, because if somebody had previously pushed the netconf mount, it's now using another mech. And that is even harder to upgrade because you lose which file where they came from, because they're all just munged. All the sections are munged together. It makes it even harder. To try to do something automated or a script to try to migrate it. Yes?
That is assuming the same namespace, right?
The same namespace?
Because you get the namespace, you do understand what... So it is an XML file, right, with full namespaces and tie back to the originating model. So even though the external persister, which, munges it into a single XML, which is not an intrinsic feature of config subsystem, it's just the only implementation that we have, is going to retain the information as to where that config data belongs, right? So if as an application you separate your internal wiring and your user-facing wiring into two different modules, you obviously will see that difference in namespaces even in that munged XML, right?
Yeah, possibly. But you also have the services sections, and then the required capabilities sections to also possibly know what to upgrade. And you just, I don't.
So users don't usually modify those, right?
No, they don't.
And you can actually reconstruct those sections based on the service injection you're seeing.
But needless to say, it's a pain in the ass.
I'm not saying I'm not saying it's something you should be doing with Vi or Emacs, but it's not to say it's not doable or it's impossible.
I'm not saying it's not doable. It's not something I personally want to do. You know,
the key thing is you cannot treat it as text. You have to treat it as XML, and you have to correlate the information that is available to you.
So given that, you know, so there's options. If you know, some smart person can figure out how to generically migrate in a way which works for every single one, and current config and all that, and come up with a script. Okay, that's an option. Other options are, given, you know, the config system, you know, has been, I think it's been, you know, it's done well. You know, it was a way to get, you know, deterministic ordering, and I think it's worked. You know, and it's difficult to use, and there are more standard options to do code wiring that are out there, frameworks like Blueprint and
that everybody else uses.
That most of the rest of the OSGI Carafe world uses.
Can we assume that the upgrade we're trying to do here is between versions that are backward compatible or not?
Backwards compatible?
Because the config is actually one of the interfaces of that component, right? And if it was changed from one end to another, there's no way other than manually migrating it. If you change the name of the properties, the objects, and everything, no way around it, right?
If you change your config yang?
The config file interface.
The assumption in, yeah, I think the assumption is that it's a backward compatible change, and I don't think we've had very few non-backward compatible changes to config yang in OpenDaylight, maybe none. Yeah, I mean, it means you can't remove properties and you can't rename a property. As long as all you do is, you know, add properties, everything works fine. And I think that's by and large what we've done. There may have been a few exceptions, but you know, those are, if you had really a list of properties, that's in a file somewhere, you know, figuring out which ones of them are and aren't supported in the new thing and throwing a warning in a script is pretty straightforward. What's hard is I think what we've done is we've created a system where it's entirely possible to do this, but we've taken something which would have been possible with like a 4-line Perl script and turned it into something which now involves a couple thousand lines of XML parsing, deep understanding of namespaces, understanding the Yang file, understanding 2 different Yang files, what's changed. And I agree with Robert, it's not impossible, but I think what we've done is we've taken something that could have been debuggable, understandable, and something that could have been written a couple lines of Python and Perl. We've turned it into something which now involves an XML parser, a Yang parser, and something which can understand the diffs between the two different parsed Yangs. And that's, it's a design choice you could have made. I think it's a deeply unfortunate one for something that's user-facing.
Well, if as part of the upgrade process, we'll translate that config file to a simpler format and then do the diff, it will be much easier. And then we'll have a pretty simple.
Well, can we make this even? So
if you assume that your data definition language is appropriate.
So I think at the end of the day, we've made a series of design decisions which have led us to the fact that we have very rich user configuration data that needs to be understood and migrated, and we didn't. And if we intended to build any of the tools that made that easy, we didn't. And there are 2 ways to get yourself. There are 3 ways I know to get yourself out of that hole. One of them is that you say, if we're not going to build the tools, we move to something simpler. The second one is that you build the tools. And the third one is you move to something that already has the tools. And I think those are the only 3 sane options, and despite this being a raised issue repeatedly with the config subsystem, we've utterly failed to deliver any one of those 3 viable solutions. And I don't really care which one it is, but the advisory group made it really clear we need to fix this problem as part of Boron. That's their top priority, is to get upgrades to work in a sane way. And I think this sort of, the rest of this stuff I think is pretty straightforward because CFG files, I think we could just say there are very specific ways in which you are allowed to modify CFG files that we will support upgrades for. And we could put that in the release notes. I think that's a fine thing to say. The other CFG files are simple enough that you could probably get away with that. The config files we just can't, because we actually have explicitly asked users to provide config and config files in the past, and we explicitly change wiring, and so there's no way to punt on that one. The actual data yang, we have to sort of punt it to applications and say your application either supports upgrades or doesn't, and if it does, if it doesn't, we just list you as incompatible with being upgraded. If you do, you have to either have the same yang model with the same semantics, or you have to provide a translator that translates your old thing to the new thing. And that's, but I think that that's sort of where we need to get. And the thing which is missing there is the tooling to do, I think the rest of the stuff we pretty much understand. The tooling to actually grok, understand, and manage changing both possibly the schema as well as two different sources of changes going into the actual configuration data for the config files is the biggest stumbling block, and one which we need to either move away from it, make it simpler, or build tools. And I don't think we have there's no 4th option. The 4th option is don't deliver upgrades.
Well, no, so there is sort of a middle perfect process. You can at least float those, right?
No, I mean,
I couldn't patch your files because, like, patch does, right?
Yeah, I mean, no. So you could.
And you float the log.
There's two different levels of being. You have to, as long as you got reasonable errors to users they could understand. But there's 2 different sources of errors. One of them is the mechanical. Could patch figure out how to do it? And the second one is, if patch did something it thought was semantically valid, does OpenDaylight choke on it? And there's a third part, which is, or does OpenDaylight not choke on it, but have it corrupt the internal state of OpenDaylight sufficiently? Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm with you.
You said user-facing?
Yeah.
It's polite. I tried to do something, it didn't work, and Lee's going to tell you about what I know.
Okay? Yeah, no. I think that's valid. I mean, if we could figure out a way to describe, I think in general, if you can describe to a user what they're looking for and why it didn't work, we probably ought to be able to automate it to a large extent. And so I think that there is a cop-out which says we could just document the crap out of this and say what we would do. But at the point at which writing good enough documentation that real users can follow it is often more complicated than writing a script, having tried to do it in the past. But I think I wouldn't throw it off the table. I mean, I'm looking for anything at all that gets us to the point where a sane user doesn't want to kill us while still trying to still keeping their data for at least the things which have made some effort to migrate their data across releases. And I don't think we've made that an explicit goal of any previous release. I think it's useful to do that now. And I think the biggest stumbling block I'm aware of is this.
I think it's going to fall back on the project to provide upgrades.
That's certainly.
I don't see any other way.
So I guess that's. Well, so if you're going to schema change your Yang modeled data, I think that's true. I think that the configuration data, you could also insist that projects parse and understand their config data. The difference is that most projects are now familiar with and used to dealing with the MD-SAL and their stored data and how they pull it out and manipulate it. I think that there are a very small single-digit number of projects that understand their config files well enough to think about starting that process.
In your experience, how many the users are actually modifying this configuration file? Because in my I find it difficult too, right? Like you said, most developers.
So the canonical example. The canonical examples were BGP and netconf, where that was explicitly, where in the past you explicitly configured them, and it was the only configuration point for adding mount points in netconf was modifying the config file, and there's now, and Lithium added so in the long run this is going to be easier because in Lithium they added the ability to do that through the data store instead of the config files. Brilliant.
Instead of solving the big just kind of enumerate the most often modified ones and find a simpler way of just migrating those instead of everything.
I don't. What other OpenFlow probably has little knobs you can tweak.
I mean, L2 switch is
L2
another one
switch
which
does.
everybody configures in different ways if you
Yeah,
pull it in. There's a ton of different knobs in there. I mean, the answer was huge numbers of projects at the very beginning created lots and lots of config options and config XML. And the problem is that, like, saying we support upgrades starting with Boron and and so, you know, there you can't upgrade to Boron, but if you could somehow get to Boron, you could upgrade everything else. I mean, it's better than nothing. It's not like I'm not going to turn it away if somebody gives it to me, but it's, I think, going to be disappointing to our end users to not. I think our goal should be able to provide some sane way for people to move from beryllium to boron, in at least a constrained environment.
And users include integrators too, like what you're doing.
I mean,
you guys are doing.
I mean, yeah.
You're going to run into this problem. Well, I'm not sure you, Moist, or whoever.
Upgrades are hard.
In our case, at least, we are not, whatever we
You haven't had
want
to
be
deal with it
configured,
yet.
We are providing a UI to configure rather than telling them to go and modify, so we know what they could have modified. We don't support
Fair.
them going and modifying the files directly anywhere.
Oh, either whether you do it through a UI or not, but you're still
No, what I'm saying
writing
is
to
then
files.
it's a subset and we can keep track of
Sorry.
what they modify.
Yeah.
But
So-
if the tools aren't included in, so if the tools aren't included as part of what OpenDaylight does, they don't count. I mean, I'm like, we've delivered a solution that's unupgradable then. I mean, it's like saying, you know, OpenDaylight supports OpenFlow as long as you apply these 7,000 patches off to the side. I mean, and then claiming we do. I mean, we need that. You can't providing OpenDaylight and saying, well, you could support upgrades if you wrote this tool is different from having OpenDaylight actually support upgrades. If we want to set the contract that says, you know, these are the files you're allowed to modify and here's how you're allowed to modify them, and OpenDaylight won't support upgrades unless you do that, and your tool honors that, that would be a reasonable thing. But we have no contract about we have no contract we've established with anybody about under what circumstances we will believe that we will try to honor your requests. About in the process of an upgrade. And if we established that contract and tools honored that, then at least maybe you could argue that we don't need the tools in order to claim you support upgrades, which is that, you know, we've described explicitly what's there, but I still think saying there could exist a tool that supports upgrades is, I mean, simple matter of code is a joke for a reason.
Are we still questioning whether we want to deliver upgrade?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So that's.
We all agree that we want this product.
Does anybody disagree that that upgrade should be a goal for boron? That we should be able to upgrade from beryllium to boron? I'm honestly curious.
In a sane way.
We really need to make it from boron. I mean, ideally we should support from beryllium to boron, but if we find it very hard, at least make it so that boron.
Yeah, I mean, so I think
Going forward, yeah.
the bare minimum.
is our
So let me ask this question. So, does anybody disagree that we should support from boron to, is it carbon? So that would be the release that will come out in 6 months to a release that comes out 12 months from now. We should do the groundwork to make that upgrade process easy. Does anybody disagree with that statement? And that should be a high priority. Raise your hand if you agree with the statement. Okay. So now the next question is, I mean, are there people that really think that we should not focus on it for beryllium to boron, which is that, like, it's just too impossible, we shouldn't even think about it for beryllium to boron, it would be a waste of our cycles, we're likely to lose time and thus avoid delivering other things that are critical?
Maybe the goal
You would.
identifying all the problems, and that itself could be the goal. I don't know if
So I mean, so personally, I mean, I'd like to see at least for stable. I'd like to see us have. I mean, so this is. I think at the end of the day, it's going to come to a TSC decision, and so this is not me. So, and somebody will have to vote on it. But I'd like to see it be the case that we see the stable feature. So we got mature projects for the first time ever at the end of the beryllium release. As part of mature projects, one of the things that was in the beryllium release but didn't end up happening was that mature projects were entitled to have stable features. And a stable feature would be a newer, and would be something, would be essentially a badge of honor saying this thing actually adheres to a higher set of standards, more usable by end users. And I'd like to see it be the case that if you are a stable feature, you have either very clear user understandable instructions on how to migrate from the previous release to this release, or a script that does it automatically. And that's to say that my goal wouldn't necessarily be that everything in OpenDaylight can be migrated from Beryllium to Boron, because I think that that's untenable. I just don't think we have, there are projects at the edge that aren't going to do it. I think there's actually probably projects at the edge that aren't going to do the work in Boron to the future, because we have projects that are just, they're incubation projects, they're always going to be incubation projects, and that's fine with me, it's fine with them. But I think that having some core set of projects that we encourage to have key functionality that can be migrated from Beryllium to Boron, I think is a really good goal. And barring there being some catastrophic failure modes that we don't understand that make it impossible, I'd strongly encourage us to get there. That being said, you know, by myself, I have no authority to require that. The TSC at large could make that decision about what the properties of the Boron release would be.
So, given that, so config XML files we've already identified as a potential pain point for upgrades.
No.
Well, it says it's on.
Just that one's actually.
The green light is lying. So I think you already outlined 3 basic, I mean, we have some options here, you know, and as Colin wrote here, this is the biggest, this is why we have the problem, mainly. We mingle code wiring with potential user configuration, whether it's written through a UI or you VI the file, don't matter. So we're mixing the 2 into 1 file, where you want to preserve the properties that you supply in your Yang to allow users to to tweak and tweak knobs and how the code works and stuff like that. But on the other hand, you need to take any code wiring changes that occur in the new release. So. You know, one thing you could say is, projects, put this on the projects, right? Every project, keep the config system, but say, look, projects, in order to be considered, make yourself better upgradable, separate these 2, right? And or provide a script to do the upgrade process. Well, that's another option. I'm saying, could say, look. Just punt to the projects and say, you have to make yourself upgradable. Here's a way you can do this. We still do have the problem with the current XML file getting munged. So there still would have to be a script either way, or something, something to figure that one out. Or it's total. I think we need the script either way, Colin, to deal with that. Either way. So.
So at the end of the day, some things you have to put the application.
Okay. Well, however, let's not get bogged down and implement how we would implement an upgrade thing. So, sorry. So we could do this.
The only reason I was asking that
I want to go to the second option. So we could do this via scripts, code, whatever. By splitting, splitting your app, app and user and code wiring stuff and scripts, whatever, to munge and the current config XML, whatever. Another option is to basically move away from the config system altogether and use more standard tools in they're in OSGI, like Blueprint, Declarative Services, Config Admin, which virtually probably most of the rest of the OSGI Carafe world is doing. And I think, so what does that do for you? Well, it takes care of this problem, right? Your code wiring is inherently usually part of your bundle. So upgrades you get for free. It gets deployed from your bundle. And any user-facing configuration, you can use CFG files, and with Blueprint, you can with certain, I don't know if anybody's used Blueprint, but Aries, but it makes it very easy to inject all of that into your beans and like Spring. Anybody use Spring? Spring IOC? See, Blueprint's the same thing. So, in fact, it was patterned after it. It was by Spring. It was, yeah. Yeah, exactly, yeah. They donated it to, and then Gemini became. So, so I think, and so what does that do? So that helps us because that takes care of this problem just by itself. And it also, eliminates the complication of config yang.